Last week at their annual meeting, the Southern Baptist Convention adopted a resolution expressing grave moral, biblical, and theological concerns about in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Now, since the Alabama State Supreme Court recognized the dignity of embryos earlier this year, IVF has become a political flashpoint. As I discussed last segment, Senate Democrats recently brought an IVF messaging bill to the Senate floor for a vote, demonstrating their desire to use IVF as a wedge issue. And the Southern Baptist Convention resolution has led to, well, let's just say incorrect information from the legacy media that further distracts from the real issue. What I want to explore here is that if science makes it available, does that mean we should pursue it? And what ethical and moral and theological boundaries should we be looking to? Joining me now to discuss this and more is Dr. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the author of many books, including Tell Me the Stories of Jesus, The Explosive Power of Jesus' Parables. Dr. Mohler, welcome back to Washington Watch. Good to see you.
Tony, it's always good to be with you. Thank you.
So speaking of legacy media, I want to play a clip of Morning Joe weighing in on this topic of the Southern Baptist and IVF. Play clip number 8, please.
My family knows about this personally. Families desperate to have babies. I mean, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. And this is, again, I think there's a very extreme view for the convention to take on the whole.
Yeah.
I will just say, if there is such value for life, then I think the Southern Baptist Church should have a very, very harsh, direct statement on the death penalty, on war.
Dr. Mohler, I'm going to let you take on that line of reasoning and argumentation.
Well, you know, Joe Scarborough is a disappointment at so many levels. You know, he was elected as a Republican member of Congress and frankly voted in a basically pro-life pattern during the time he was in Congress. Wasn't very vocal on the issue. I guess now we know why. He's just become a part of the cultural left. And when it comes to the issue of abortion, and especially as it relates to Christianity, he just lies. So, for example, you know, he's come out and said that the Christian church was basically pro-choice for the first 20 centuries until the issue of abortion was hijacked by Republican operatives. That's absolutely ridiculous, as you know. It is a contradiction of clear biblical teachings. It's also contradicted by the evidence of the early church, which so quickly, in documents such as the Didache, came to the conclusion that having anything to do with abortion was incompatible with being a Christian. So it's just misrepresentation. It's what you expect from MSNBC, right?
Not to mention that it was the Christian church that went out and rescued the babies that were abandoned.
Absolutely.
The exposure to die because they were unwanted. So let's talk about, of course, he switches arguments. He doesn't really stay with the IVF. He switches over to war, which the Southern Baptists has spoken to that issue too, but we won't go there today. Let's talk about the Southern Baptist Convention taking this position and releasing a statement on a current public policy issue.
Right. Well, you know, that's what resolutions are for the Southern Baptist Convention. It's a way for the Southern Baptist messengers, as we call them, from our churches, sent by the churches to make a public statement of Christian witness on these issues. This was the first time the Southern Baptist Convention has spoken clearly to the IVF issue, and it did speak clearly. For that, I'm very thankful. But remember, Tony, it's just a part of our moral responsibility these days to understand that when Christians get together, there are issues, and the Christian conscience has to speak out on these issues. Southern Baptists were too late to get into the game on abortion, too late to come to the defense of the unborn. Thankfully, we got there. On the issue of IVF, frankly, we're already late, but it's very important that we speak biblically.
Well, I think the timing of the resolution last week, when you look at the backdrop of what took place in the Senate, made it very timely. And I think they're happy if we're talking about things that are not relevant, if they're not application of biblical truth to current pressing moral and social problems. And that's, quite frankly, I think that's the description. Jesus said we're salt and light, both in our orthodoxy as well as our orthopraxy, that we are both operating from our theological construct and what we're talking about, but also how we're living this out. So I want to do both in our time together in talking
Right.
about both this policy position, the ethical, the moral, the theological boundaries that Scripture provides, but
Yeah.
then as Christians, how should we be operating in this culture as it pertains to this issue?
I think it's really important that Christians step back and say, well, all right, it is an unalloyed good thing for a married couple, a man and a woman married, to desire a child. It is a heartbreaking thing when they face difficulty having a child. My wife and I were there for years, and we know the struggle with infertility. And so it's just wonderful to want a child. And every single child is made in God's image, regardless of the circumstances of that child's conception or parentage or birth. The Christian church, as you pointed out, has always said the desire for a child for a married couple is good, just an unquestionable good. And that child is a good. But that doesn't bless every sexual act that brings a child into being. That doesn't bless every medical technology. And certainly when it comes to IVF, I think Christians have just not given time to think through what's at stake. And to be honest, the situation has changed somewhat over the last several years. And I think many Christians don't know what IVF really represents these days.
Right. They actually don't know the process. So in this process
That's
of IVF, where there is an excess number of embryos that are created through this process, you could have anywhere from a dozen excess embryos to see which ones actually work because of the expense of the process. So this was a debate, I don't know, back when George W. Bush was president. There was a debate about these frozen embryos and what happens with them.
Absolutely.
And we had snowflake babies. These were babies, these embryos, frozen embryos that were adopted. So the question here is, what happens to these embryos that are created? As you said, they hold the image of God. What happens to those who are not brought forth in the pregnancy?
This is an absolute test, Tony, as to whether we've been honest all these years when we've said that we believe that life begins at conception, which means fertilization. If we believe that, then we believe that in every single case, for every single embryo, under every condition. And I do believe we mean that, but we better mean it and understand that that's going to require us to speak up for every embryo at every stage of development in every context. And right now, and this is just what's happened, when the first IVF happened, it was, they were referred to as test tube babies, and first in the United Kingdom and then in the United States. Extremely expensive. And so the very miracle was that there was one embryo that was transplanted. Now, as Christians, we have moral concerns about that, just in terms of abstracting reproduction from the context of marriage, the conjugal union of a man and a woman.
Right.
But the big issue came with the transformation of IVF into an industry, and that's what it is. It's big money. It's an industry. And for pure reasons of what now are described as best practices, and this is about finance as well as, frankly, the moral insult to the embryo, as you say, they're creating multiple excess embryos in these just what are considered standard practice for IVF. And so you have hundreds of thousands, probably already now well north of 1 million human embryos that are actually described as excess. Some of them are right now frozen. Some will be subjected to medical experimentation. It takes us back to the Bush issue. And all of them eventually will be destroyed. So if we believe that life begins at conception, fertilization, as we said, we have a grave, monumental moral crisis. One final thing. We also know that under the practice of IVF right now, they're doing embryo sorting. They're rating embryos. This is eugenics. They're, in other words, saying this embryo we want, that embryo we don't want. The other thing is it's abstracted from marriage. So now you have same-sex couples. You have two men who say they're having a baby. It's by IVF. It wasn't the intention of those who brought about the very first IVF procedures, but that's where it is. You have single women who are simply saying, I have a right to have a baby. This is becoming a very, very difficult challenge for the Christian conscience.
You also have multiple parental embryos being created, so not just two.
Absolutely.
So there's a number.
No, absolutely. It's commonly these days it's between 8 and 16.
So how do we deal with this? I mean, there's the underlying issues you started out with is that it's a good thing for a man and a woman who are married to want to have children, and there are obstacles in some cases, and this was a path. But now we see how this often happens with technology. It's exploited to go way beyond the
That's right.
boundaries of what is morally ethical. What do we do?
Well, I'll be honest, Tony. I advise Christian couples, married couples, that means a man married to a woman, not to use IVF technology. And at the very least, to use it, if they choose to use it, only in ways that fully respect the dignity and sanctity of life, and that means of every embryo. So that means every embryo that is created in the process transferred to the womb. Now, I don't think there are many doctors who will do that. There aren't insurance companies, I think, that'll pay for that. They're going for this more cost advantageous way of creating all these excess embryos. So in other words, I'm trying to be intellectually honest. There are ways of reducing risk. I don't think there's any way of avoiding the risk. But the big question is, who's going to speak up for the embryos? And the reality is, you've got Christian couples that think there are no big moral issues with IVF. And I think it's really important that Christian pastors and an organization like the Southern Baptist Convention be very clear. There are grave moral issues at stake here.
There are other options available for men and women that are struggling to have children. There's other therapies,
Right.
other avenues that they can pursue that do not have the moral and ethical implications that IVF has developed.
No, you're exactly right about that. And of course, a lot of medical practitioners just want to ignore, because it's become a giant industry, the IVF industry. They want to ignore the moral complications. But yes, and by the way, one of the things we need to recognize, and I so appreciate the fact you mentioned the early Christians rescuing the abandoned babies. This is what many Christian couples are now doing with the frozen embryos. And you mentioned snowflake adoptions. And, you know, you wouldn't want to have to do this any more than you would fail to cry out the grave moral evil of abandoning a child. But once a child's abandoned, it is a wonderful, God-honoring thing to save that child. And I think many Christian couples wrestling with this, they need to understand that it's an unfortunate moral reality that there's so many embryos out there. And I think it's a good and honorable thing that so many Christians are seeking now, Christian couples, to adopt them.
So, Dr. Mohler, just have a couple minutes left. I want to shift for the last couple of minutes on the policymakers.
Yes.
This is our public policy and the moral and ethical implications here are intersecting. So what is the path forward for our policymakers as it pertains to this? Because some of them are running scared over this issue and just doing whatever, just to say they did something.
Well, you know, Tony, I think we're both able to remember when Roe v. Wade was handed down, and quite frankly, the issue was, how in the world do we awaken the evangelical conscience over this? And it took some time. I think it's going to take time on this issue. And the many politicians, and frankly, they called themselves pro-life, and yet some of them are now offering bills in support of IVF, completely ignoring the destruction of so many embryos, human embryos that are involved. And so I don't think we should minimize the political challenge we face to try to work for the legal protection of the unborn at every stage, and that means also the embryonic stage. But quite frankly, we need to make certain that our elected representatives and candidates who call themselves pro-life understand that pro-life means pro-life. We've said at every stage of development, from fertilization until natural death. Did we mean it? We better make sure they mean it. And, you know, I think we will acknowledge there's a learning curve here. We want to help people understand this, but I'm afraid we're going to find out there are an awful lot of people who were pro-life when it was more convenient than, as you well know, after Dobbs, when we've got lots of fronts on which to fight.
Dr. Mohler, I think this is just yet another example of where truth is standing counter to the culture today, and it is going to be a true test of whether or not we will stand on that truth.
I agree with you, and I want to tell you I really appreciate the fact that you've taken this on so directly in our consideration. We all want to be faithful as Christians, and it's going to take some talking about this issue and thinking it through. So thank you.
Well, always appreciate your insights, Dr. Mohler. Love having you on the program. Thanks for taking time to join us today.
God bless you.